Jack Holloway was not having a good day. This wasn't unusual. Jack rarely had what most would call good days. As the lone human maintenance technician aboard the interspecies diplomatic vessel Harmonious Accord, his days generally consisted of fixing things that other species had broken while pretending to understand their complaints. Human Jack, the atmospheric calibration in my quarters is precisely 0.03% too humid for optimal Kraxian comfort. Ambassador Vorn would warble through his speech apparatus. Jack would nod sympathetically while mentally calculating how many other work orders he'd have to postpone to adjust a setting that no sensor in the galaxy could actually detect. Such was life as the token human in a galaxy that viewed Earth as the cosmic equivalent of a backwater town that somehow got invited to the big city conference. Humanity, as the newest species to join the Galactic Confederation, occupied a peculiar position in interstellar politics. Physically weaker than most species, lacking natural defenses, and possessing only modest technological capabilities by comparison, that humans were largely regarded as non-threatening curiosities. What humans lacked in raw strength or advanced tech, they made up for with what other species found to be a disturbing level of adaptability and unpredictability. Jack, however, was perhaps the least impressive specimen of humanity aboard the Accord. At 37, with a slowly expanding waistline and thinning brown hair, he looked exactly like what he was, a maintenance guy who'd taken the off-world job because the pay was better and his ex-wife had gotten a house. Maintenance log, day 341, Jack dictated to his handheld as he crawled through a service duct that was clearly designed for a species with less rigid spines. Fixing the climate control system in Section 19B for the third time this month. Apparently, the Mervlani representatives think that freezing means something different than it does to everyone else in the known universe. Jack had developed a particular talent for jury-rigging solutions that weren't in any manual but somehow worked better than the original designs. His supervisors, all non-human, found this both impressive and vaguely concerning. "You know what your problem is, pal?" Jack addressed the malfunctioning climate control node, which blinked back at him with indifferent lights. "You're overthinking it. Sometimes you just need to be turned off and on again." He yanked a cable, waited 10 seconds, and reconnected it. The system hummed back to life with a satisfied whir. Jack grinned. "Works every time." It was the type of simple solution that baffled his alien colleagues, who often approached problems with complex algorithmic thinking, rather than what Jack called the percussive maintenance method. As he began to reassemble the access panel, Jack's communicator chimed with the ship's automated reminder, "Attention all crew. The interspecies cultural exchange reception begins in 30 minutes in the Grand Atrium. Attendance is mandatory for all diplomatic staff." Jack snorted. "Good thing I'm just the guy who fixes the toilets." The last thing he wanted was to spend an evening making awkward small talk with beings who either pitied him or studied him like some sort of primitive curiosity. He'd rather finish his shift, grab a meal packet, and spend the evening watching old Earth shows in his quarters. Little did Jack know that skipping this particular diplomatic function would end up being the most consequential decision of his unremarkable life. The first sign that something was wrong came when the emergency lighting suddenly kicked in, bathing the maintenance shaft in an eerie red glow. Jack froze, one hand still clutching his multi-tool. "That's not supposed to happen," he muttered, feeling the subtle shift as the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated momentarily. Another bad sign. The climate control node in front of him blinked erratically before settling into an emergency power conservation mode. Jack's communicator should have immediately buzzed with an all-stations alert, but it remained stubbornly silent. He tapped it a few times, getting nothing but static. "Communications blackout? Oh, that's just fantastic." Carefully, Jack began moving toward the exit of the service shaft. As he approached the maintenance hatch, he heard something that made him stop cold, heavy footsteps, definitely not belonging to any of the usual crew, and voices speaking in a harsh, clicking language he didn't recognize. Peering through the small viewpoint in the hatch, Jack saw them towering reptilian figures moving with military precision down the corridor. Their scaled bodies were covered in what appeared to be battle armor, and they carried weapons that made the standard Confederation security blasters look like toys. "Kraxx," Jack whispered, recognizing the species from his mandatory cultural sensitivity training. Known for their physical prowess and warrior culture, the Kraxx had reluctantly joined the Confederation after a series of border conflicts. They weren't exactly known for their diplomatic nature. These particular Kraxx, however, didn't look like any diplomatic delegation. They were systematically securing the corridor, checking rooms, and hurting any crew they found at gunpoint. Jack watched as they discovered a Trilaxian engineer who had been working nearby. The poor being's three eyes widened in terror as the Kraxx surrounded it. "Move to the atrium with the others," one of the Kraxx commanded in accented common speech. "Resist, and we will demonstrate why your species is too soft for survival." The timing suddenly clicked in Jack's head. The reception. Everyone who mattered on the ship, all the diplomats, high-ranking officers, and security personnel would be gathered in one convenient location. Perfect for hostage-taking. Jack retreated deeper into the maintenance shaft, his mind racing. Should he try to reach the nearest escape pod? No, the Kraxx would have those covered by now. The ship's security forces, probably already neutralized or captured at the reception. Call for help? Communications were clearly being jammed. "Think, Holloway, think," he muttered, running a hand through his thinning hair. What would the hero in a movie do? He immediately regretted that thought. Movie heroes were typically buff, skilled combatants with access to weapons and one-liners. Jack had a multi-tool, a half-eaten protein bar, and a talent for fixing faulty plumbing. A nearby explosion rocked the ship, the shock wave reverberating through the maintenance shaft. Whatever the Kraxx were doing, they weren't being subtle about it. Great. Just great. Jack slumped against the wall. The one time I skip a mandatory function, and it's the one that doesn't get attacked by space pirates. He took a deep breath. The reality of the situation was sinking in. He was likely the only crew member not under Kraxx control. Which meant, by the process of elimination, he was also the ship's last hope. "This is why I should have taken that job on the lunar colony," Jack grumbled, gathering his tools. "But no, I wanted to see the galaxy." "Well, congratulations, Holloway. You're seeing it now." With no real plan beyond basic survival, Jack began crawling deeper into the ship's maintenance system, a labyrinthine network of ducts, shafts, and access tunnels that ran like veins through the massive vessel. It was a system he knew better than anyone else aboard, human or alien. And right now, that knowledge was the only advantage he had. The maintenance system of the Harmonious Accord was never meant to be used as a covert surveillance network, but necessity. As Jack's father used to say, "This is the mother of improvisation," or something like that. Jack had spent hours carefully navigating the narrow passages, stopping at strategic junction points to get a better picture of what was happening. The view wasn't encouraging. Through ventilation grates and service panels, he'd witnessed the Kraxx systematically taking control of the ship's key systems. They moved with the precision of military professionals, not common pirates. This was a well-planned operation. "Okay, so not just random space pirates," Jack whispered to himself as he peered through a small vent into the ship's auxiliary control room. 3 Kraxx operators had bypassed the security protocols with suspicious ease and were now redirecting ship functions to their control. The leader of the group, distinguishable by the elaborate crest of spines along his head, loomed over a holographic display of the ship. Jack mentally dubbed him Spiny. "The diplomats are secured in the atrium," Spiny reported to someone over a communication device. "The ship's security forces have been neutralized, and we control all critical systems. We are proceeding on schedule, Commander." Jack strained to hear the response but could only make out a few words about ransom demands and deadlines. Whatever the Kraxx wanted, it apparently involved keeping the diplomats alive for now. Moving on, Jack worked his way toward the Grand Atrium, careful to avoid detection. The ship's design played to his advantage. Most species found the maintenance passages uncomfortably cramped, but for Jack, they were merely inconvenient. Finally reaching a ventilation hub overlooking the atrium, Jack got his first look at the hostage situation. The sight made his stomach drop. Representatives from 24 worlds, the Confederation's elite, were huddled together under the watchful eyes of armed Kraxx guards. Ambassador Vorn of Kraxx was attempting to reason with what appeared to be the operations field commander, a massive Kraxx with jet-black scales and a nasty-looking scar across his snout. Jack decided to call him Scarface, maintaining his commitment to completely unoriginal naming conventions. This action violates 17 separate articles of the Confederation Charter, Vorn was saying, his speech apparatus quivering with indignation or fear. Jack couldn't tell which. The diplomatic consequences will be severe. Scarface laughed, a sound like rocks in a garbage disposal. Diplomacy is precisely why we're here, Ambassador. My species has grown tired of negotiations that go nowhere while our territories are systematically reduced. The Kraxx sovereignty will be recognized, or this ship and everyone on it will become a political statement. Jack couldn't see any immediate way to help. The Kraxx were too many, too well armed, and too strategically positioned. He needed more information. Retreating from the atrium, Jack made his way to a maintenance junction that connected to the ship's central computer access. If he could tap into the system without alerting the Kraxx, he might be able to get a clearer picture, maybe even send a distress signal. After 20 minutes of careful work, bypassing security protocols that he technically wasn't supposed to know, but had learned through years of having to fix things nobody else wanted to touch, Jack managed to establish a limited connection to the ship's systems. The news wasn't good. The Kraxx had completely isolated the ship from outside communication. They had also set the engines on a course toward an uninhabited system, likely where they planned to rendezvous us with their main forces. Most concerning of all, Jack discovered a timer counting down in the ship's core systems. They've rigged the antimatter containment field to fail in 24 hours, Jack muttered, staring at the screen in disbelief. They're not just planning to ransom the diplomats, they're going to destroy the ship afterward. The implications were staggering. If the Harmonious Accord, the physical embodiment of interspecies cooperation, was destroyed along with representatives from across the Confederation, it could trigger an interstellar diplomatic crisis, maybe even outright war. Jack disconnected from the system and sat back against the cold metal wall of the maintenance shaft. He was no hero. He wasn't trained for this. His biggest accomplishment this week had been fixing the perpetually malfunctioning coffee synthesizer in the crew lounge. What exactly am I supposed to do against a ship full of heavily armed lizard commandos? He asked the empty corridor. Ask them nicely to put down their guns and surrender? As if in answer, the ship's environmental system kicked in, sending a blast of cold air through the vent above him. Jack shivered and then paused, a thought forming. The Kraxx were reptilian. Reptiles, generally speaking, didn't do well in cold environments. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time since the crisis began, Jack felt a small spark of hope. He might not be a security officer or a trained soldier, but he knew this ship inside and out. He knew its systems, its quirks, its vulnerabilities. And sometimes that knowledge could be more valuable than any weapon. Jack Holloway had never considered himself particularly clever. Resourceful, sure. Persistent, definitely. But as he sat cross-legged in a junction of maintenance shafts, sketching out his plan on a diagnostic tablet, he surprised himself with what was emerging. I must be out of my mind, he muttered, reviewing his notes. This is straight out of every cheesy action movie I've ever watched. Yet the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like his only option. He couldn't outfight the Kraxx, that was suicide. But maybe, just maybe, he could outthink them. Jack's plan hinged on a simple observation. The Kraxx, for all their military prowess, were operating in an unfamiliar environment. They had taken control of the ship's major systems, yes, but they didn't understand its quirks and idiosyncrasies the way Jack did, after years of crawling through its guts. First things first, Jack said to himself, I need to become a ghost. Using his maintenance access, Jack began systematically altering small but crucial aspects of the ship's environmental systems. He adjusted the lighting in certain corridors to flicker unpredictably. He rerouted ventilation to create odd, moaning sounds in specific sections. He programmed maintenance robots to move briefly into view before disappearing again. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would immediately scream sabotage, but enough to create an atmosphere of unease. Psychological Warfare 101, courtesy of late-night viewing of classic horror films. Now for Phase 2, Jack whispered, moving toward the cargo holds. The Harmonious Accord, as a diplomatic vessel, carried all manner of cultural artifacts and gifts from various worlds. Among these was a collection of Terran items meant to showcase human culture. Jack had helped install the exhibit months ago and remembered something that might come in handy. A vintage Halloween decoration, a motion-activated holographic ghost that had been included as an example of Earth cultural festivities. It wasn't much, but combined with some creative use of the ship's maintenance drones, it might be enough to start sowing seeds of doubt among the Kraxx. As Jack worked, he found himself growing more confident. The Kraxx were warriors used to facing enemies head-on. They weren't prepared for shadows and whispers, for enemies they couldn't see or fight in the traditional sense. And there was something else, something Jack had noticed during his reconnaissance. The Kraxx, for all their bluster about superiority, seemed genuinely uneasy about humans. He'd overheard two guards talking. "I don't like having a human aboard," one had said. "They're unpredictable." "The commander says they're physically weak," the other had replied. "No natural weapons, no enhanced senses. That's what makes them dangerous. They don't fight like normal species. They use tricks." Jack smiled at the memory. Apparently, humanity's reputation for being scrappy survivors had made an impression. He could use that. After retrieving the holographic projector and several other useful items from storage, Jack made his way to a critical juncture in the ship's layout. From here, he could affect systems across multiple decks while remaining hidden in the maintenance network. "Let's see," he muttered, checking his improvised map. "The Kraxx have patrols here, and here. They've got guards stationed at all the major junctions and the bridge. But they're spread thin, probably no more than 30 of them total. Still terrible odds, but not impossible. Jack didn't need to defeat them all, he just needed to create enough chaos and fear to make them vulnerable." As he finalized his preparations, Jack couldn't help but laugh softly at the absurdity of it all. Here he was, an unremarkable maintenance technician, planning psychological warfare against an elite commando unit of space reptiles. "If I survive this," he promised himself, "I'm definitely asking for a raise." With everything in place, Jack took a deep breath and initiated the first step of his plan. Throughout the ship, lights dimmed momentarily before returning to normal, except now, in certain corridors, they would pulse subtly, almost imperceptibly, creating a subliminal sense of unease. Through the ventilation shaft, Jack heard a Kraxx guard ask another, "Did you see that?" "See what?" "Lighting. The lights. They changed." "You're being paranoid." Jack smiled grimly. Paranoia was exactly what he was counting on. Phase 1 had begun. The first real test of Jack's plan came 3 hours into his campaign of subtle sabotage. He'd been methodically working his way through the ship, creating what he hoped was an atmosphere of mounting dread among the Kraxx invaders. Now, hiding in a service compartment near the secondary mess hall, he watched his handiwork unfold. 2 Kraxx guards had entered the room, sweeping it for any signs of resistance. Jack triggered his first trap, a simple but effective trick involving the food synthesizers. All 6 units activated simultaneously, their displays flashing random patterns while they emitted a high-pitched whine that Jack knew would be particularly irritating to Kraxx hearing. "What is that noise?" The first guard snarled, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. "Ship malfunction," the second replied, though he didn't sound convinced. "These vessels are built by the lowest bidder." Jack waited until they had almost relaxed before triggering his next effect. The room's temperature plummeted suddenly by 10 degrees, while the lights dimmed to a ghostly blue. Through carefully placed speakers, he played a recording he'd made by dragging metal tools along the ship's hull, a spine-chilling screech that echoed through the room. The reaction was everything Jack had hoped for. Both Kraxx visibly tensed, their scales bristling. "That was not a malfunction," the first guard hissed. "Call it in." As the second guard reached for his communicator, Jack activated the holographic projector he'd planted earlier. The cheesy Halloween ghost, which had seemed so tacky during the cultural exhibition, now floated ethereally across the far end of the mess hall. Its programmed moan combining with Jack's custom sound effects. The effect was instantaneous. Both Kraxx opened fire, their energy weapons blasting holes in the wall where the hologram had appeared. By the time they realized they were shooting at nothing, Jack had already cut power to the room, plunging them into total darkness except for their weapon lights. "This ship is cursed," one of them shouted, genuine fear in his voice. Jack could hardly believe it was working. As the guards frantically called for backup, he retreated deeper into the maintenance system, moving to his next target. Over the next few hours, Jack orchestrated increasingly elaborate scenarios throughout the ship. In one section, he reprogrammed cleaning drones to move in synchronized patterns that mimicked hunting behavior. In another, he created phantom readings on the Kraxx's own scanning equipment, suggesting life forms that disappeared whenever they investigated. With each incident, the tension among the Kraxx grew. Jack overheard snatches of their communications, filled with increasingly anxious reports of anomalies and unexplained phenomena. Even better, he could tell they were starting to distrust their own equipment, second-guessing readings and jumping at shadows. The crowning achievement came when Jack managed to isolate two Kraxx in a corridor and hit them with his full arsenal of effects: temperature drops, phantom sounds, flickering lights, and finally a maintenance robot he'd modified to lurch toward them with jerky, unnatural movements while emitting a garbled message in their own language. The Kraxx actually fled, abandoning their patrol route and babbling into their communicators about human bioweapons and psionic attacks. Jack couldn't believe his luck. The Kraxx weren't just on edge, they were genuinely frightened. Their rigid military discipline was crumbling in the face of threats they couldn't understand or combat. The true turning point came when Jack overheard Scarface berating his increasingly nervous troops. "You are Kraxx warriors." The commander snarled at a group of guards who had abandoned their post after experiencing one of Jack's hauntings. "The greatest fighters in the galaxy. And you flee from shadows and noises?" "It's not just noises, Commander," one brave soul protested. They say humans have ways of fighting that don't make sense. Psychological warfare. Making you see things that aren't there. Making you fear things you can't fight. Superstitious nonsense." Scarface roared, but Jack could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Listening from his hiding place, Jack grinned. "Time to escalate." Using the ship's internal communication system, Jack broadcast a message to the entire vessel but distorted it, breaking it into fragments, layering it with static and echoes until it was barely recognizable as speech, just clear enough for one phrase to be understood. "I'm coming for you." The effect was electric. Throughout the ship, Kraxx patrols began to consolidate, abandoning their carefully planned security perimeter to cluster together in larger groups, exactly as Jack had hoped. With the Kraxx now huddled together, focusing their attention outward against a phantom menace, Jack was able to move more freely through the areas they had abandoned. He made his way to the ship's security station, which the Kraxx had repurposed as a secondary command post. There, he implemented the riskiest part of his plan, directly confronting the enemy. Using the ship's announcement system, Jack spoke directly to the Kraxx leadership, his voice echoing throughout the vessel. "Attention, Kraxx forces. This is the human you've been looking for. You have 1 hour to release the hostages and surrender. After that, I stop playing nice." It was the bluff of a lifetime, delivered with more confidence than Jack actually felt. But as he watched through a security feed, he saw Spiny turn to Scarface with unmistakable alarm. "Commander, perhaps we should consider." Silence. Scarface roared, but Jack could see the commander's scales had taken on a paler hue, a sign of stress in Kraxx physiology. "Find this human. Now." But the damage was done. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and fear was beginning to bloom. The final act of Jack's improvised psychological operation began with absolute silence. After his ultimatum, he cut all non-essential systems ship-wide, plunging large sections of the Harmonious Accord into darkness and silence. The life support and gravity remained functional, but little else. Through security feeds that he'd managed to access, Jack watched as the Kraxx forces descended into barely controlled panic. Teams sent to hunt him down returned empty-handed, reporting strange occurrences and inexplicable equipment failures. Some didn't return at all, not because Jack had harmed them, but because they'd gotten lost in the darkened corridors, or had barricaded themselves in rooms to escape the humans' psionic attacks. Scarface was losing control. His once disciplined force was unraveling, and the ransom plan was falling apart. Just as Jack had hoped, the commander made a critical error. He pulled even more guards from the atrium to search the ship, leaving the hostages under lighter guard. It was time for the endgame. Jack made his way to the environmental control hub. From here he could control the atmosphere in specific sections of the ship. With careful adjustments, he lowered the oxygen content in the corridors where most of the search teams were operating, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to induce lightheadedness and heighten anxiety. Simultaneously, he dropped the temperature in those same areas to levels that would make the reptilian Kraxx sluggish and disoriented. For his final act, Jack released his piece de resistance, a non-toxic but impressive-looking cloud of vapor from the fire suppression system. It, combined with strobe lighting effects and alarm sounds at precisely the frequency most distressing to Kraxx hearing. The result was chaos. Kraxx troops, already on edge from hours of unexplained phenomena, now faced what seemed like a coordinated attack on all their senses. Through the security feeds, Jack watched as discipline completely collapsed. Some Kraxx fired blindly at shadows. Others fled. A few simply froze, overwhelmed by stimuli they couldn't process. Taking advantage of the confusion, Jack made his way to the auxiliary control room. Using his maintenance override codes, he locked down sections of the ship, trapping scattered groups of Kraxx in isolated areas. Within 20 minutes, he had effectively divided the invading force into manageable pockets, unable to communicate or support each other. Finally, Jack approached the atrium. Only 4 guards remained with the hostages, and they looked terrified, jumping at every sound and constantly checking their weapons. Through the ventilation system, Jack deployed his last tricks: more holographic projections, bizarre sounds, and finally, a complete power failure in the atrium itself. In the darkness and confusion, Jack entered through a maintenance hatch, wearing a makeshift outfit assembled from emergency equipment that made him look far more imposing than his actual maintenance technician self. With strategic use of emergency lighting to cast dramatic shadows, he appeared suddenly before the remaining guards like an avenging spirit. "Your forces have been neutralized," Jack announced, his voice amplified through a jury-rigged speaker system. "Surrender now." Whether it was his appearance, the culmination of hours of psychological stress, or simply the final straw, the effect was remarkable. The Kraxx guards, elite warriors from a species known throughout the galaxy for their ferocity, placed their weapons on the ground and raised their hands in surrender. "The human has psionic abilities," one whispered to another. "I told you they were unnatural." Jack could hardly believe it had worked. He had bluffed his way to victory without firing a shot. The aftermath was almost as surreal as the crisis itself. When Confederation security forces finally arrived responding to an emergency beacon Jack had managed to activate once he had control of the ship's systems, they found a bizarre scene: dozens of Kraxx warriors locked in various rooms or huddled in defensive positions, all thoroughly convinced they had faced some sort of superhuman opponent. The diplomatic fallout was immediate and far-reaching. The Kraxx sovereignty officially disavowed the operation, claiming it was the work of radical elements. The Confederation, however, used the incident to push through new security protocols and, more significantly, to reevaluate humanity's role in interstellar affairs. Jack found himself suddenly elevated from anonymous maintenance technician to reluctant hero. Ambassador Vorn personally recommended him for the Confederation's highest civilian honor, praising his uniquely human approach to conflict resolution. The most remarkable aspect, Vorn told the Confederation Security Council, was that the human Holloway defeated an elite military force without causing a single casualty. It demonstrates why humans, despite their physical limitations, must be considered valuable members of our collective. The final irony came 3 weeks later, When the Confederation adopted what became informally known as the Holloway Protocol, a diplomatic addendum officially acknowledging the unpredictable nature of humans as a strategic asset rather than a liability. Jack, meanwhile, received the promotion he never wanted, moving from maintenance technician to special consultant on human integration affairs, a position that came with better quarters, higher pay, and much more uncomfortable diplomatic functions. "So let me get this straight," Jack said during his first official briefing. "You want me to attend diplomatic receptions and basically remind everyone that humans are weird and unpredictable enough to be taken seriously?" "Precisely," Ambassador Vaughan replied, his speech apparatus vibrating with what Jack had learned to recognize as amusement. "Your presence alone will serve as a subtle reminder of what happened on the Harmonious Accord." Jack sighed, adjusting his uncomfortable new uniform. "I should have taken that job on the lunar colony." But as he looked around at the assembled diplomatic staff, representatives from dozens of worlds who now regarded humans with a new respect, Jack couldn't help but smile. Sometimes being underestimated was the greatest advantage of all. And somewhere in the back of his mind he wondered just how many other unremarkable humans were out there in the galaxy, quietly fixing things and waiting for their moment to show just how remarkable humanity could be.